By 1900, to the concern of many citizens, nearly every aspect of the American economy was dominated by massive corporations. Americans purchased their meat from the Beef Trust, sugar from the Sugar Trust, and their fuel from Standard Oil. Nearly all progressives believed that big business was far too powerful and required regulation, but they disagreed on both the means and the end goals of regulation. Some, calling for the nationalization of corporations, claimed that public ownership was the only solution. Others, rejecting socialism as too extreme, called for various types of governmental regulation to keep capitalism intact. But interventionists also varied by degree. Some, demanding a complete breakup of big business, imagined a return to small, competitive businesses that would compete on a level playing field. Others insisted on only minimal regulation of the worst offenders. President Theodore Roosevelt made a tax on trusts a hallmark of his presidency. The executive, he boldly proclaimed, is the steward of the public welfare. Happily using the bully pulpit of the presidency to attack big business, Roosevelt nonetheless did so in a decidedly selective and moderate fashion. He made it clear that he was not opposed to big business in principle. Roosevelt believed that large corporations were not only inevitable, part of the natural evolution of business, but they also benefited society through the abundant production of cheap goods and their ability to compete internationally and strengthen the American presence globally. There were, he insisted, both good trusts and bad trusts. Only bad trusts, those engaged in unfair competition and practices such as price fixing and issuing watered stock, should be broken apart. Carefully choosing several high-profile trusts to attack, Roosevelt soon gained a reputation as a trust buster. In 1902, he took on Northern Securities, a planned railroad monopoly created principally by J.P. Morgan and John D. Rockefeller. At Roosevelt's request, the Justice Department successfully prosecuted the company by using the Sherman Antitrust Act. It charged the company with illegal restraint of trade and claimed that its practices led to higher and unfair freight charges for consumers. A few months later, the Justice Department successfully attacked the Beef Trust, especially unpopular with the public given the, quote, embalmed beef scandal that had poisoned and killed more U.S. soldiers than Spanish bullets in the Spanish-American War. The federal government charged the Beef Trust with price fixing and restraining competition. To the delight of Roosevelt and the public, the Supreme Court upheld both cases, and both trusts were dissolved. In his second term, Roosevelt continued his selective prosecution of bad trusts. Promising a, quote, square deal for the American people, Roosevelt responded to growing public outrage against Standard Oil. Probably the most hated company in the nation, Standard's reputation and that of its head, John D. Rockefeller, grew even worse after muckraker Ida Tarbell published a massive expose in the company, published in McClure's magazine from 1902 to 1904. The report depicted Standard as a cutthroat, win-at-all-costs corporation with no concern for public good, and Rockefeller as unscrupulous and money-mad. Tarbell's efforts ultimately sparked hearings and investigations of Standard Oil at the state level, and the company soon faced prosecution in 8 states. In 1906, the federal government began its successful prosecution of Standard Oil, and in 1911, the Supreme Court upheld a federal court's ruling charging the company with violating antitrust laws and ordered that the massive trust be dismantled. Roosevelt, learning of the news while on safari in Africa, called the decision, quote, one of the most signal triumphs of decency which has ever been won in our country, end quote. Roosevelt's attack on the trusts, however, hardly made a dent in the power of massive corporations. Despite upholding the dismantling of several key trusts, courts, remaining conservative in their interpretation of the Sherman Antitrust Act, pointed out that only reasonable limits on interstate trade were illegal. Rather than shriveling up, Standard, for example, continued to flourish, and Rockefeller's wealth and power were undamaged and actually enhanced. Despite Roosevelt's reputation as a trust buster, his successor, Republican William Howard Taft, actually engaged in twice as many antitrust suits as Roosevelt. His administration successfully prosecuted U.S. Steel and the Sugar Trust. But the corpulent and lumbering president, the antithesis of the charismatic, athletic, and energetic Roosevelt, never managed to get credit for his accomplishments, as he was unable to maintain the positive relationship with the press and public cultivated by Roosevelt. Although Taft admired Roosevelt, he was more conservative than his predecessor. During his presidency, he aimed to rein in the expanding role of the federal government. Through a series of missteps, Taft managed to disillusion both the progressive and conservative old guard wings of the Republican Party. His blunders led to Roosevelt's decision to run as the progressive Bull Moose candidate in 1912, which split the party and guaranteed Taft's defeat by Woodrow Wilson. During the 1912 campaign, Wilson, a Democratic progressive, rejected Roosevelt's distinction between good and bad trust, as well as his vision of an expansive federal government. The quote, New Nationalism, Roosevelt's platform in 1912, advocated expansive federal government used for the public interest. By contrast, Wilson attacked all bigness, whether in government or business, and advocated the quote, New Freedom, in hopes of restoring small business and fair competition enforced with only minimal government interference. As president, however, Wilson did expand the power of the federal government and used it to regulate business. Wilson signed more reform legislation than Roosevelt and Taft combined. In 1913, he signed the Federal Reserve Act to create a central banking system that significantly strengthened the country's financial system by, among other functions, overseeing the nation's monetary policy and providing supervision and regulation to the nation's banks. The next year, under Wilson's direction, Congress passed the Clayton Antitrust Act, meant to supplement and strengthen the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 by outlawing a number of practices such as exclusive sales contracts, holding companies, and price discrimination. Moreover, the law outlawed the use of injunctions against labor unions and legalized peaceful strikes, pickets, and boycotts. But like the Sherman Act before it, the Clayton Act also contained numerous loopholes. Subsequent court decisions also weakened its effectiveness. Notably, the Clayton Act was signed at the same time as another important regulatory act establishing the Federal Trade Commission. The FTC was charged with overseeing and regulating business activity and halting unfair trade practices. Another key reform, initiated by the Taft administration and instituted under Wilson's, was the 1913 ratification of the 16th Amendment, authorizing a federal income tax on both personal and corporate income. Before this time, the U.S. had one of the lowest tax rates in the industrial world. While America's establishment of empire required additional funding, populists, socialists, and progressives had long called for a graduated income tax that would place a heavier tax burden on wealthy individuals and corporations. Before 1913, federal revenues derived from public lands and customs. After 1913, the federal income tax would provide the bulk of monies that filled federal coffers for expenditures from social services to military spending.